Thanks. Thanks so much. It's great to be here in such a beautiful, beautiful church. It makes you feel that God must be really on our side in the anti-landlord struggle, so that's good news. I'm not going to embarrass the audience by asking how many of you have had your rent gone up recently, but I imagine it's pretty much everyone who rents. And I'm not going to embarrass the audience by asking how many of you have had a very sharp and unaffordable rent increase recently, but I imagine, again, it'll be pretty much everyone who rents. And I think that if I'd asked that question of an audience in the 1990s, it would have been very, very different. But we've come to see rent gouging as a fact of life, and we've forgotten how close we came to abolishing landlordism altogether in the 70s. Like how realistic it is, how necessary it is, and how to do it. In Britain, we are absolutely leading the world in homelessness. We have more than 50 people per 10,000 is homeless, which makes us more than double our nearest competitor. The US is below 20 people per 10,000, so we're beating the US in homelessness. And the weird thing is that Britain builds more homes than the US, and had more homes to start with, and somehow still dwarfs its homelessness statistics. And the secret thing, the thing that no one wants you to know, is that there isn't really a housing shortage that's causing this. There are more than enough homes to go around. We have more housing than we did before the housing crisis started. So it's not a case of needing to build more. It's not a case of migrants taking all the housing. We've had a net gain in housing as the housing crisis has managed to get worse. If we go back to the 90s, when the housing situation they had then looks like a paradise compared to what we've got now, we've gained nearly 10% of homes per capita. So we've got an awful lot more than we used to. But people who are in your position, in your stage of life, in the mid-90s, would have had much, much better and much, much cheaper housing than you do now. But somehow things have gotten so much worse for our generation than they were for them. Because over the last 20 years, the total amount that our country pays to landlords has trebled. It was about 30 billion at the end of the 1990s. It's 90 billion pounds today, 90 billion pounds of rent. And for scale, the defence budget in Britain is 50 billion pounds. So it's more than double that we pay to landlords, that we pay for every single aspect of what we might call national security and defence spending. And it's going nowhere. It's being absolutely wasted on landlordism. It's not going to anything useful. It's not going to anything productive. It's going into the pockets of people who are wealthy enough to already own at least one, but probably multiple homes in a country that has more than enough housing to go around. It's going straight from your wages, and it's going straight from the taxpayer, which means that wage bills are very, very high, tax bills are very, very high. And it's going into the hands of the already wealthy. From the 1990s, we've changed from a system of broadly affordable housing to a system where 1 in every 21 adults in the UK is a landlord. So we have 4 times as many landlords as teachers. We obviously need teachers an awful lot more than we need landlords. And we have about twice as many landlords as NHS staff, the NHS being England's largest employer. Which means statistically there's quite a few of you in the room. I'm not going to embarrass you by asking you to put your hands up, but maybe you should buy a massive round of Bloody Marys for everyone to go around to say sorry. So the point is, don't believe the property developers. Don't believe the fools who tell you that the only way to solve the housing crisis is to knock down Lewisham or Croydon or Stratford or Wembley and rebuild it as a sort of Poundland Emerald City with expensive new housing and aspects of social cleansing. It's a crisis of price, it's a crisis of extraction, it's not a crisis of how many homes physically are there in our cities and in our towns. I'm sure loads of you in the room resent your landlords, which is fun, certainly those of you who are renters, and I encourage that, but there's a bigger picture here, and the point I want to make is to think about how landlordism is the root source of much, much broader social problems in Britain. The idea that everything in Britain, all the problems facing our society, really boils down to housing problems. I've been travelling around the country quite a lot with this book out, going to places like Birmingham, Nottingham, Croydon, where large, important local authorities are declaring bankruptcy. So places like Birmingham, Britain's second city, is facing a 100% cut to its arts and culture funding. They're dimming the streetlights, they're closing down libraries, they're closing down activities for children and young people. Like, the things that make life nice, the things that make life worth living, are being taken away from us. And in most cases, these local authorities are going bankrupt because of landlordism. Councils are openly blaming the cost of temporary accommodation, which is public money directly transferred to landlords. And they're blaming the cost of their homelessness services, and homelessness tends to be caused by high rents and by no-fault evictions. So we seem to prefer wasting money on landlordism rather than to protect these major councils from bankruptcy, because we could decimate that spending through rent controls. We could prevent homelessness by ending evictions. We could halve the amount of money that we're spending on landlordism within weeks, but instead we choose to let these councils go bankrupt, and we choose to let our lives become more miserable as a result. How does this work? Well, Thatcher and Blair famously deregulated the private rented sector. We have a system of no-fault evictions. And to give you a sense of how that works, when I was, during the pandemic, my activist group was working with a member called Anna, who was on one of these short-term contracts that we all have. And she claimed housing benefits. And the government passed an increase in housing benefit rates because they were worried about joblessness, evictions due to lockdowns. And Anna's landlord wrote to her and said, "I've noticed that housing benefit has gone up. I'm raising your rent by precisely the same amount." And obviously, when our landlords raise our rent, we know what the answer is when they ask us, because if we say no, they'll find a more pliable household who'll say yes. So Anna didn't really have a choice. She had to sign a new tenancy agreement. The money went straight to the landlord. Now, that was the most sort of benevolent, generous-minded government policy I've seen in years. And all it did was translate a higher amount of public money into landlord money. It didn't just provide the landlord with a higher income every week, but it meant that Anna's home was suddenly that much more valuable as an asset for any other landlord who wanted to buy it. So the state was directly sponsoring an increase in the value of that property, skimming more money out of the public purse and driving the value of the property market as a result. And this isn't just a problem of the private rented sector itself, it spreads out more broadly. I had a friend recently who wanted to buy her first home, and when she went to the viewing in Liverpool, which has a surplus of housing, the only other people there were a gaggle of landlords trying to work out what the rent would be, and thus how much the house was worth. And that's how the property market works more broadly, that's how it works across the board, because when you sell a house, you work out what the price would be by thinking about an imaginary pool of buyers and what they'd be willing to pay for it. And that imaginary pool of buyers may or may not include landlords. So the price has got to be competitive between landlords and other buyers. You are competing with landlordism when you're buying a home. So what that means is that all house prices are ultimately rooted in, derived from, the profitability of the private rented sector. And obviously when you have runaway rents, as we obviously do, that means house prices going up across the board. It means a serious problem for everyone. Of course, you know this. You know how quickly rents go up. And the amazing thing is that landlords don't give a reason. They say, I'm putting the rent up because I can. Most landlords aren't terribly leveraged with mortgages. Most landlords are getting by terribly comfortably. But they have this imaginary notion of the market rent. And they just seem to have discovered this God-given right for the rent to go up. And as a society, we seem to have accepted it because that is what the legal framework allows. And the problem is that all house prices, the entire housing market, is sitting on top of that phenomenon of ever-rising rents. Because when you're buying a house, it doesn't just reflect the rent that you could get now, but baked into the price is the increased rent in year 2, the further increased rent in year 3. It reflects just how profitable the private rented sector is. So if you're a buyer, or if you're a homeowner who's struggling to meet their costs or who can't afford to live in the type of housing that you'd really like to, that's because of landlordism. The housing market is rooted in the unlimited profitability of the rented sector in which rents run away. So the landlord is everyone's enemy. The landlord is the enemy of decent, affordable housing. The landlord is driving up costs for everyone and causing the misery that we see around us. And 50 years ago, they almost disappeared from the face of the earth. There were powerful rent controls, there were high interest rates. In some areas, rents were as low as 5% of people's wages. And what that meant was it was just unprofitable to be a landlord. They couldn't afford to do basic repairs, they couldn't make a profit, so they were selling up. And in the mid-70s, it had dwindled to about 6%, but it wasn't just decreasing. The pace at which it was decreasing was accelerating. And everyone on the left and right thought this was a good idea, because landlords were being forced to sell up, which meant they were selling to new owner-occupiers. It meant they were selling to local authorities who would repurpose formerly private flats as social housing. And it was easier for councils to acquire land because suddenly they weren't competing with landlordism and with a housing economy that was founded in landlordism. So it became much, much easier for councils to build social housing because landlordism was dying. So the point is that it's good when landlords die out, when the private rented sector shrinks. It doesn't mean there are fewer homes. It means there are fewer landlords. And it means everyone ends up in a form of housing that is by definition better and cheaper than the private rented sector. It was so recently, and we came so close. That was the future we were promised, a world of secure, affordable housing, and they took it away from us and replaced it with the housing crisis that we're living through today. Because Thatcher reversed all of that, she abolished rent controls, she made tenancies insecure with the explicit aim of tempting landlords back to the dying private rented sector. And it worked, and that's the kind of wasteland that we're living in today. Blair consolidated it because he signalled to landlords that he wasn't going to reverse it. And there are some amazing quotes from the 20th century where you've got landlords saying, well, the problem we have is that Labour kind of tightens up rent controls, the Conservative loosens them, but we can't trust it because land is a long-term investment and we need certainty. And there's this amazing quote from land investors where they say, you don't allow your best china to be in a kitchen where a careful dishwasher is occasionally replaced by someone who throws the plates about. And first of all, you're like, well, that's such an insulting way to think of our homes, like they're the kind of Fabergé eggs of investors. But second of all, it shows the harm that New Labour did because they signalled to landlords, look, you're safe, you're going to be fine, we're not reversing rent controls. And they are just as responsible for the housing crisis we see today as the Thatcher government was. He gave a green light to landlordism. And the other thing you had in the 90s and 2000s was the kind of social rehabilitation of the landlord. Throughout history, they've been a kind of figure of scorn, a figure of public hatred. And throughout the 90s and 2000s, we kind of grew up with these property TV shows, which made it a sort of harmless and respectable endeavour. And we've forgotten. We've forgotten how much, as a society, we justifiably used to loathe this figure who took all the rent and didn't do anything productive. The left hated them, the right hated them. Everyone agreed that a landlord is nothing but a leech on the productive economy. They tend to provide the worst kinds of housing. They always provide the most expensive form of housing. And it really is remarkable how little we despise landlordism today. And my kind of plea is to try and remember the old wisdom that their only job is to make us poorer and to make our lives more difficult. I'm often asked about good landlords. What about nice people who let below the market rent? What about the nice guys? I mean, first of all, they're statistically negligible because rents are so high at the moment that the number of landlords who do charge a cheap rent are statistically a rounding error. And second, I mean, if we're interested in good landlords, if we believe that people should have affordable rents and decent standards, surely we want that for everyone, not just the people who are lucky enough to live with someone who, on a whim, decides to be a nice guy. Surely it should be a legal requirement forced by law and not left to the whims of individuals, because we know that landlords don't tend to behave well as a class unless the law forces them to, and anyone who's ever rented will be painfully aware of that. So what's really weird about Britain is if you compare it to somewhere like Germany, the kind of bargain that's struck in Germany at the social level between industry and government and workers is they like housing costs to be low because that for business means we can keep our wage bills low. For the public, it means we get cheap rents, and for the government, it means we get low taxes. And that's the kind of social acceptable thing all over the world. In Britain, we have the opposite. We have an economy that is entirely premised on high housing costs. We're a country that spends £30 billion on housing benefit. If any other country was wasting that much public money, the IMF would intervene. But we seem to be really, really relaxed about endless state spending on landlordism. It was sort of designed to be like a kind of personal social safety net. Your home would be your care in later life, your supplement for bad wages, and it worked for a bit, but it's run out of road, and we're now at a proper crisis point. And I keep making this argument against the idea of shortage, and it's not just me trying to be sort of countercultural. It's important because for as long as the government believes that there is a housing shortage, the only thing it can think of to stop that is to build more housing. And the only way it can build more housing is to cajole property developers to develop more. And the only way it can do that is to ensure that the cost of housing remains consistently high and growing, so that property developers have profit margins. So in other words, renters must continue to get poorer. Renters must continue to be the ones who hold up the housing market by giving an ever greater proportion of their wages to landlords in order to justify the property market, in order to produce more housing. We know it doesn't work because we keep trying it. If you look at any area where there's loads of new development, Manchester or Lewisham, you look around and you say, well, has this made things better or worse? Whereas we know for a fact that what we did in the 20th century of rent controls, of secure tenancies, of attacking landlordism and making it unprofitable, that really did work. They're the mad ones because they keep trying to do the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, and we're the sensible ones. So what we have here in Britain, really uniquely, is a complete free market in land and housing. It was completely deregulated, and we've returned to this sort of Victorian system of unfettered rent extraction, where ever higher amounts can be taken from the public and put into the housing market. It's an experiment in free marketism, and it's failed. This is what happens when you take the brakes off landlordism. It's a wealth transfer from poorer renters to wealthy asset owners, from the younger generation of renters to an older generation who benefited from the social state and from higher wages and from decent pensions. Generally from racialised people to whiter people, and from the regions of the UK to southeast England. In every case, the poorer part of the population is transferring money through the housing system to the wealthier part. It's a scandal, it's a misery, and it's got to end for all of us. But to end on a point of optimism, after World War II, landlordism was responsible for about 60% of housing. 30 years later, it had fallen down to 6%, and it was dying rapidly. It then took another 30 or 40 years to be wound back up to the point where we are today. But the exciting thing is that if we started tomorrow, we could easily abolish landlords within my lifetime, because we've done it before. That's an exciting prospect. I think it's the future we deserve, and I'll leave it there, but I'm happy to take any questions.